August 1, 1941. Bethpage, Long Island, New York. Chief Engineer Robert Hall occupied the pilot's position as the experimental aircraft moved along the runway, its cylindrical main body appearing almost excessively weighty for a solitary power plant to elevate. The XTB-1 test aircraft angled upward.
Welcome back, Captain.
And at that
We were
instant,
worried.
doubters in the naval establishment
We had it under
expressed
control. Good to be
disapproval.
back.
The most substantial single-engine plane they had witnessed. Excessively complex, excessively heavy, excessively ambitious. Not one among them could have imagined this awkward-looking machine, rejected by cynics as an impending engineering catastrophe, would ultimately destroy more hostile naval vessels than any alternative American military plane in historical records. The calculations of maritime conflict stood ready for revision, not via graceful blueprint, but through utter destructive efficiency enclosed in an excessively complex framework that inexplicably outperformed all other aerial vehicles. The path to this historic instant started in March 1939 when the United States Naval Forces published specifications that would test each aircraft producer in America. The Douglas TBD Devastator, unveiled in 1937, had already become outdated. The Navy required a substitute, and they required it rapidly. The specifications appeared unachievable. A maximum velocity of 300 miles per hour, an operational distance of 1,000 miles, a three-person team, all munitions stored inside in a weapons compartment, protective shielding for the crew, self-sealing petroleum containers, and most challengingly, an electrically operated upper defensive turret, a characteristic that had foiled all prior endeavors. 13 corporations presented proposals. The contest rapidly condensed to two final competitors. VA Aviation proposed the XTB-U-1, a streamlined, graceful blueprint that initially earned acclaim from Navy assessors. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation presented the XTB-F-1, a blueprint that appeared as though someone had taken their successful F-4F Wildcat combat plane and expanded it to distorted dimensions. The VA blueprint was more aesthetically pleasing. The Grumman blueprint was intricate. Volt secured the preliminary agreement, but VA was already overwhelmed with contracts for their F-4U Corsair combat plane. They absolutely could not manufacture torpedo bombers within the Navy's essential time frame. The agreement transferred to Grumman, and Leroy Grumman's team discovered themselves facing an unachievable due date to construct an unachievable aircraft. Robert Hall, the engineering specialist in practical development, confronted the mountain of specifications. Each Navy requirement involved incorporating mass, intricacy, and mechanisms that had never been effectively incorporated into a carrier-based plane. The internal weapons compartment alone represented a nightmare. It needed sufficient capacity to contain either a 22.4-inch Mark 13 torpedo, weighing 2,000 pounds, or 4 500-pound explosives, or anti-submarine devices, or naval mines. The doors needed reliable operation in saltwater conditions, high-force maneuvers, and combat impairment. The mechanized turret introduced even larger difficulties. Previous attempts at rear defensive positions had failed because fluid-powered and hand-operated mechanisms were too sluggish, too undependable, too susceptible to combat impairment. Grumman selected an electrically powered turret, risking the complete design on innovation that had never been verified in combat. If the electrical mechanism malfunctioned, the rear gunner would become defenseless. The wing storage system incorporated another level of intricacy. To accommodate carrier lifts and storage decks, the wings required folding capability. But the Avenger's wings represented the largest span among all Navy aircraft, 54 feet completely extended. Leroy Grumman personally resolved this challenge during a planning conference. Utilizing a pink eraser to symbolize the main body and paper fasteners as wings, he identified what became recognized as the stow wing, a complex angular storage mechanism that enabled the enormous wings to fold rearward and upward concurrently, minimizing the wingspan to merely 18 feet. The mechanism demanded hydraulic systems, securing bolts, and structural reinforcements that added hundreds of pounds. The Wright 2600 power plant, a dual-row, 14-cylinder radial generating 1,700 horsepower, represented the most potent engine accessible. But even this colossal unit strained to elevate the loaded aircraft. Unladen weight, 1,080 pounds. Combat prepared weight, 15,905 pounds. This established the TBF as the heaviest single-engine aircraft globally. Skeptics within the Navy labeled it the expectant creature. Others called it the turkey. The designations were not accolades. On December 30, 1940, the Navy placed a purchase order for 286 TBF-1 aircraft, exceeding 7 months before the test model had even flown. The critical nature was evident. War approached, and the Navy needed torpedo bombers immediately, difficulties notwithstanding. The test model's inaugural flight on August 1, 1941, demonstrated both potential and complications. The aircraft flew, but it flew like a heavy truck, weighty, slow-moving, completely unlike the agile combat planes pilots knew. The controls were unresponsive. The visibility was inadequate for the pilot. Despite the elevated cockpit placement, the aircraft demanded constant attention, constant adjustment, constant physical effort. But it remained stable. It could carry its full load, and the internal mechanisms, all those complex systems critics claimed would malfunction, actually functioned. Then arrived November 28, 1941. The initial test model ignited during an experimental flight near Brentwood, New York. Both test pilots, Bob Hall and Gordon Israel, successfully parachuted as flames consumed the aircraft. The test model crashed and was demolished. Critics attacked. The blueprint was too elaborate, too many systems, too many malfunction points. The electrical turret, the folding wings, the enormous weapons compartment. Everything was too ambitious. The initiative should be terminated. Grumman's reaction was to accelerate. The secondary test model was nearly ready. Testing continued. Modifications were implemented. Challenges were resolved by forceful engineering solutions. On January 3, 1942, the initial manufacturing TBF-1 was completed. Less than 5 months following the first test model's destruction. Less than 2 weeks following Pearl Harbor brought America into the conflict. By early June 1942, more than 100 TBF Avengers had been provided to the Navy. 6 of these aircraft were assigned to Torpedo Squadron 8 for evaluation. The squadron's devastators had already deployed aboard the carrier Hornet. The 6 Avengers reached Pearl Harbor merely hours after the carriers had departed for a decisive confrontation near a small atoll named Midway. Volunteers were requested. 6 crews raised their hands. Many had never flown beyond visible land. All 6 aircraft reached Midway Island. June 4, 1942, 0710 hours. 6 brand-new TBF Avengers lifted off from Midway Island's Henderson Field, portion of the initial assault wave against the Japanese carrier field. The aircraft had been operational for precisely 5 months. The crews had virtually no combat experience. They were operating the most complex torpedo bomber ever constructed directly into the core of the most experienced carrier force worldwide. The Japanese Defensive Air Patrol descended upon them like predators. Mitsubishi A6M0 combat planes operated by veterans of Pearl Harbor, China, and the Dutch East Indies tore into the laborious Avengers. The TBF's defensive weapons, a single 50 caliber automatic firearm in the upper turret and a 30 caliber gun in the lower position, proved inadequate against determined fighter assaults. The Avengers were slow. At maximum torpedo attack velocity, they could scarcely achieve 130 miles per hour.
Critics renewed their demands to cancel the initiative. The aircraft was too vulnerable, too elaborate. The losses demonstrated it was a failure. But intelligence officers examining the damaged aircraft reached a different conclusion. Ensign Ernest's TBF had withstood sufficient impairment to demolish 10 normal aircraft. Yet it had flown home with 2 survivors. The electrical turret, despite the catastrophic impairment, had continued operating until the turret gunner was killed. The weapons compartment doors had operated correctly under fire. The folding wing mechanism had not malfunctioned despite multiple impacts to the wing framework. The right engine had operated for 2 hours after being struck multiple times. The aircraft was not too elaborate. It was too resilient. Each intricate system, each backup, each alternative had been designed into the TBF specifically for this situation, absorbing impairment and continuing to combat. The over-engineered Advanced Avenger had brought its crew home when no alternative aircraft could have survived. Manufacturing accelerated. By August 1942, dozens of Avengers were reaching fleet squadrons. Torpedo Squadron 8 reorganized with new pilots and new aircraft. They would continue to earn 2 Presidential Unit citations, becoming one of the most honored squadrons in naval aviation history. Ensign Ernest rejoined the squadron and fought at Guadalcanal, earning his 2nd Navy Cross. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, delivered the initial genuine examination of Avenger tactics with experienced crews. 28 TBFs from the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise assaulted the Japanese fleet. 13 Avengers from Saratoga's VT-8 and 15 from Enterprise's VT-3 coordinated their approach. They sank the light carrier Ryuju with multiple torpedo impacts. 7 Avengers were lost, but their survivors learned vital lessons. The aircraft could withstand enormous impairment. The electrical turret could engage multiple fighters simultaneously. The internal weapons compartment allowed for rapid munitions modifications. The extended range allowed for strikes far beyond what previous torpedo bombers could achieve. November 1942 delivered the naval confrontation of Guadalcanal. Marine Corps and Navy Avengers performed the crucial function in sinking the Japanese battleship Hiju, a 37,000-ton giant that had been disabled in nocturnal combat. The Avengers delivered torpedoes into the drifting Colossal, proving that the complex aircraft could eliminate capital ships. But the most extraordinary transformation was occurring in the Atlantic Ocean, distant from Pacific headlines. German U-boats were winning the tonnage conflict, sinking Allied merchant vessels faster than they could be substituted. The introduction of small escort carriers provided air coverage for convoys, but existing aircraft were inadequate for anti-submarine warfare. The Avenger, with its large weapons compartment, extended range, and capacity to carry radar, demonstrated ideal for the function. The TBF-1D variant, equipped with ASB surface detection radar, could identify surfaced U-boats at night or in adverse weather. The large weapons compartment could carry depth charges, explosives, acoustic torpedoes, and the top-secret Mark 24 homing torpedo. Avengers operating from escort carriers began tracking U-boats with destructive efficiency. The aircraft that had been designed to eliminate battleships was now hunting submarines. The tactics were graceful in their straightforwardness. Avengers equipped with radar would patrol ahead of convoys searching for surfaced U-boats. When contact was established, the Avenger would assault with depth charges and rockets, compelling the submarine to submerge. Once underwater, the submarine's velocity decreased from 18 knots to 8 knots. The Avenger would circle above, deploying sonobuoys to monitor the submerged submarine while summoning destroyer escorts for the elimination. If the submarine attempted to surface and escape, the Avenger would be waiting with additional depth charges. If the submarine remained submerged, the destroyers would arrive. From May 1943 to May 1945, Avengers operating from escort carriers sank or assisted in sinking 35 U-boats in the Atlantic. British Avengers, which the Royal Navy designated Tarpon and later Avenger, added to the total. The complete submarine eliminations reached approximately 30 when counting Pacific operations against Japanese submarines. No alternative aircraft approached this record. The advanced radar systems, the large internal compartment that could carry multiple weapon types, the extended endurance that allowed 8-hour patrols, everything combined to create the most effective submarine eliminator of the conflict. The year 1944 delivered the Avenger to its maximum effectiveness. By this period, nearly 10,000 had been constructed. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division had assumed most manufacturing, producing 7,546 TVMs, while Grumman built 2,290 TBFs. The transition had been remarkable. When Grumman needed to concentrate on manufacturing the new F-6F Hellcat combat plane, they delivered a demonstration TBF to General Motors assembled entirely with sheet metal fasteners. This PK Avenger, named for Parker Callan fastener producer, enabled GM engineers to disassemble the aircraft portion by portion and redesign it for automotive-style mass manufacturing. Leroy Grumman had questioned whether GM could construct even one Avenger. Instead, GM manufactured more than 3 times as many as Grumman itself. The TBM-3 variant, with a more powerful R2600-20 engine generating 1,900 horsepower, began reaching squadrons in mid-1944. The additional power assisted in offsetting the mass of new radar equipment, supplementary armor, and increased petroleum capacity. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 showcased everything the Avenger could accomplish. The engagement, later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, devastated Japanese carrier aviation. American fighters eliminated over 250 Japanese aircraft in a solitary day. But the genuine examination arrived afterward. Admiral Mitzer learned the Japanese carrier fleet was retreating at extreme distance. Over 200 Avengers participated in the mission Beyond Darkness. Mitzer's desperate gamble to intercept the escaping enemy. The strike launched late in the afternoon, knowing many aircraft would return in darkness. Avengers from the carrier Belleau Wood sank the light carrier Hugh, striking the Japanese vessel with torpedoes in deteriorating weather and fading illumination. 247 Japanese sailors died when Hugh capsized. Many Avengers exhausted their fuel on the return flight, ditching in the ocean or crashing on carrier decks in complete darkness. Mitzer ordered each ship in the fleet to activate lights, violating all blackout protocols to guide the aircraft home. 80 pilots and crew were lost, but the mission proved the Avenger could operate in conditions that would ground alternative bombers. The extended range, the dependable engines, the resilient airframe, everything contributed to missions that should have been unachievable. October 1944 delivered the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval confrontation in history. Over 200,000 personnel participated. Japanese forces committed virtually their entire remaining fleet in a desperate attempt to demolish the American invasion force at Leyte. The confrontation expanded across hundreds of miles of ocean, involving 4 separate engagements over 3 days. Approximately 400 Avengers participated in all phases of the confrontation. The engagement at Samar became one of the most dramatic confrontations in naval history. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts carried Avengers and Wildcats designed for ground support, not fleet engagement. When Admiral Takeo Kurida's center force appeared on the horizon at dawn on October 25th, the Americans were outnumbered and outgunned catastrophically. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commanding officer of Gambier Bay's Composite Squadron 10, directed his Avengers in continuous assaults against the enormous Japanese vessels. The Avengers had no armor-piercing explosives. Many had no torpedoes, having been loaded for ground support missions. They assaulted regardless, executing repeated approaches with whatever munitions they carried. Some pilots executed dry approaches with no weapons whatsoever, attempting to distract Japanese gunners and purchase time for the carriers to escape. The small destroyers charged the Japanese battleships in suicidal torpedo assaults. The Avengers coordinated with them, assaulting from multiple directions simultaneously. Gambier Bay was struck repeatedly and sank, taking over 100 men with her. But the ferocity of the American defense
They had also sunk or assisted in sinking 12 carriers, 4 additional battleships, 19 cruisers, 25 destroyers, and approximately 30 submarines. The complete tonnage exceeded 1 million tons of enemy shipping. No alternative aircraft type approached this record. The intricate torpedo bomber that critics had dismissed in 1941 had become the most effective ship eliminator in history. But the vast majority of Avenger missions were not dramatic torpedo assaults. By late 1944, Japanese surface vessels rarely ventured from port. The Mark 13 torpedo, despite late-war improvements, remained problematic, demanding slow, straight assault approaches that exposed aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire. Avengers increasingly shifted to conventional bombing, skip bombing, and rocket assaults. The large internal compartment that could carry a solitary 2,000-pound torpedo could also carry 2,000 pounds of explosives, rockets, or combinations of weapons. Avengers supported amphibious landings across the Pacific, dropping explosives and firing rockets against Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, and troop concentrations. The missions were unglamorous but essential. The aircraft's adaptability extended beyond combat. The spacious interior could transport cargo, mail, and personnel. Avengers served as air ambulances, evacuating injured from island airstrips. They flew reconnaissance missions, mapping enemy positions. They deployed mines in Japanese harbors and coastal waters. They performed search and rescue, locating downed pilots. The sophisticated design that seemed like a liability in 1941 demonstrated to be the aircraft's greatest strength by 1945. The Avenger could accomplish everything. One Avenger pilot who encountered the aircraft's resilience personally was Ensign George Herbert Walker Bush. Born June 12, 1924, Bush enlisted in the Navy on his 18th birthday, June 12, 1942, the day he graduated from Phillips Academy. He became the youngest commissioned naval aviator at the time when he earned his wings. On June 9, 1943, at age 18, Bush was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51 aboard the carrier San Jacinto. He flew 58 combat missions in Avengers, logging 1,228 flight hours and making 128 carrier landings. He participated in operations against Wake Island, the Marianas, the Bonin Islands, and the Philippines. On September 2, 1944, 19-year-old Bush was operating his TBM Avenger, named Barbara after his fiancée, from the carrier San Jacinto on a bombing mission against Japanese installations on Chichijima. His crew consisted of Lieutenant Junior Grade William White, the munitions officer, and Radioman Second Class John Delaney. The target was a radio transmitter complex heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns. Bush's aircraft was struck by anti-aircraft fire over the target. The engine ignited. Smoke filled the cockpit. Despite the fire, Bush continued the assault and completed his bomb run, striking the radio facility. As flames spread through the main body, Bush gave the command to evacuate. He directed the burning aircraft out to sea, away from the island, to provide his crew the optimal opportunity for rescue, distant from Japanese forces. Bush evacuated at approximately 2,000 feet. His parachute deployed successfully, but he struck his head on the tail stabilizer as he exited the aircraft. He landed in the ocean, bleeding from a forehead injury. When he surfaced, he observed no indication of his two crew members. Neither White nor Delaney survived. Their parachutes failed to deploy properly. Bush inflated his life raft and paddled desperately away from Chichijima. Japanese boats emerged from the island, searching for him. He paddled for hours, weakening from his injury and exhaustion. Other American aircraft circled above, attempting to protect him until rescue arrived. After 4 hours in the water, the submarine USS Finback surfaced nearby. Crewmen pulled the exhausted pilot aboard. Bush was the solitary survivor from his aircraft. For his actions at Chichijima, completing his bomb run despite his aircraft being ablaze, Bush was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He would complete his combat tour, then return stateside as a flight instructor. After the conflict, Bush would serve as a congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice president, and finally the 41st President of the United States. In 2009, the Navy commissioned the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush, designated CVN-77, in his honor. Bush flew 58 combat missions in Avengers, logging 1,228 flight hours and making 128 carrier landings. He encountered what thousands of other Avenger pilots learned. The aircraft was intricate, demanding, and unforgiving of errors. But when combat impairment arrived, when enemy fire struck, when systems malfunctioned, the sophisticated design kept you alive. The redundancy, the over-engineering, the multiple backups, everything functioned together to bring crews home alive. The statistics relate the narrative that critics refused to observe. Nearly 10,000 Avengers delivered, over 46,000 combat missions flown. Total combat losses, 729 aircraft. The loss rate, 1.58% per mission, was among the lowest of any combat aircraft in the conflict. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for 422 losses. Aerial combat accounted for merely 47 losses. Operational accidents, primarily landing mishaps on carrier decks, accounted for 260. The elaborate systems that were supposed to malfunction rarely did. The aircraft that was too heavy to combat demonstrated too resilient to eliminate. Comparison with alternative torpedo bombers revealed the Avenger's dominance. The Japanese Nakajima B-5N, which had devastated Pearl Harbor, was outdated by 1943, lacking the velocity, range, and defensive weaponry to survive against American fighters. The British Fairlie Swordfish, despite its legendary status, was a fabric-covered biplane that survived only because it operated in environments where modern fighters were rare. The American Douglas TBD Devastator was slaughtered at Midway. Torpedo Squadron 8 operating Devastators from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft and 29 crew members in their assault. The Avenger operating the identical mission, the identical day, brought one aircraft home with 2 survivors. That damaged TBF demonstrated what would become the standard, survivability through robust engineering. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, the Navy's dive bomber, suffered constant mechanical problems throughout the conflict. Pilots called it the Beast, and the designation was not affectionate. The Helldiver's complexity led to malfunctions. The Avenger's complexity led to redundancy. The distinction was philosophy. Curtiss attempted to manufacture an elaborate aircraft that was barely adequate. Grumman manufactured an elaborate aircraft that was far superior to necessary, then made it even more resilient.
Post-war examination revealed the deeper reality. The Avenger succeeded not because of its complexity, but because of it. Each intricate system served multiple purposes. The large weapons compartment that added mass and complexity enabled the aircraft to carry torpedoes, explosives, depth charges, mines, radar equipment, acoustic torpedoes, reconnaissance cameras, auxiliary petroleum containers, and cargo. No alternative aircraft possessed this flexibility. The electric turret that critics claimed would malfunction demonstrated more dependable than hydraulic systems and allowed for faster tracking of assaulting fighters. The stow-wing folding mechanism that added mass and components enabled the enormous aircraft to accommodate the elevators of even the smallest escort carriers. The stow-wing became a signature characteristic of Grumman aircraft for decades, appearing on the Hellcat, Bearcat, Cougar, and eventually the E-2 Hawkeye. The resilient construction that made the aircraft heavy saved countless lives. Avengers absorbed impairment that would demolish alternative aircraft and continued flying. Pilots reported flying back to carriers with wings full of holes, engines trailing smoke, hydraulics failed, electrical systems shorted, and the aircraft still answered controls. The overbuilt framework, the redundant systems, even the excessive mass, everything contributed to bringing crews home alive. By the conclusion of the conflict, the Avenger had flown more combat missions than any alternative Navy torpedo bomber. It had sunk more enemy vessels than any other American aircraft type. It had destroyed more submarines than any other aircraft in history. It had served in more functions, more theaters, and more conditions than any contemporary bomber. The aircraft, dismissed as too intricate, had demonstrated to be perfectly engineered for everything war demanded. The Avenger service did not conclude in 1945. Post-war variants continued flying with the U.S. Navy until 1954, when newer aircraft finally replaced them in frontline service. The Royal Canadian Navy operated Avengers until 1960, utilizing them for anti-submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. The Canadian AS-3 variant featured a magnetic anomaly detection boom extending from the rear main body, sophisticated electronics for tracking submerged Soviet submarines, and the endurance to patrol the frigid North Atlantic for hours. The TBM-3E and its derivatives served with remarkable longevity. France operated Avengers from the carrier Arromanches in Indochina during the early 1950s. Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force utilized Avengers for anti-submarine patrol.
The design philosophy that created the Avenger influenced American naval aviation for decades. The emphasis on bringing crews home alive became central to U.S. Navy aircraft design. The focus on multi-role capability shaped future requirements. The integration of advanced electronics and weapon systems established patterns that continue today. The Avenger was not just a successful World War II aircraft. It was a template for how to construct combat aircraft that could adapt, survive, and accomplish diverse missions. The numbers speak for themselves. 12 aircraft carriers sunk or assisted in sinking, 6 battleships, including the 2 largest ever constructed, 19 cruisers, 25 destroyers, approximately 30 submarines, over 500 merchant vessels, 1 million tons of enemy shipping sent to the bottom, 729 aircraft lost out of nearly 10,000 constructed, 46,000 combat missions, 1.58% loss rate, the highest elimination ratio of any American aircraft in World War II, measuring vessels sunk per aircraft lost. The designers who created this record never intended to construct the most beautiful aircraft. They never tried to construct the simplest aircraft. They constructed the most effective aircraft, and effectiveness demanded sophistication. Each system, each redundancy, each backup, each ounce of additional mass contributed to the mission. Critics who observed only complications missed the purpose behind each decision. This aircraft was not elaborate for the sake of complexity. It was sophisticated because war is unpredictable, and survival demands preparation for each contingency. The manufacturing achievement itself deserves recognition. Nearly 9,836 Avengers were constructed in just 3 years. At peak manufacturing, factories delivered over 200 aircraft per month.
General Motors, a corporation that had never constructed a solitary airplane before the conflict, became the primary manufacturer through innovative production techniques. The transformation of automobile factories into aircraft plants, accomplished in months, demonstrated American industrial capacity at its peak. The identical assembly line workers who had constructed Chevrolets now constructed torpedo bombers, working 3 shifts to meet Navy demands. The Avenger's operational versatility demonstrated equally impressive. Beyond the famous torpedo assaults, Avengers flew more missions dropping conventional explosives than torpedoes. They pioneered night operations, utilizing radar to locate and assault targets in complete darkness. They performed combat search and rescue, saving hundreds of downed pilots from the Pacific. They served as airborne ambulances, evacuating critically injured personnel from island confrontations. They delivered supplies to isolated garrisons. They photographed enemy installations for intelligence examination. They patrolled shipping lanes for submarines. They provided close air support for Marine infantry. No alternative solitary aircraft type performed such diverse missions successfully. The human cost of Avenger operations, while lower than alternative torpedo bomber types, remained significant. Approximately 730 crews were lost in combat, representing over 2,000 American lives. Many more were injured. The aircraft could bring crews home through tremendous impairment, but it could not make them invulnerable. The low loss rate meant more crews survived to complete their tours. More pilots returned to train new aviators. More experience was preserved and passed forward. The engineering decisions that prioritize survivability translated directly into lives saved. Individual acts of heroism by Avenger crews fill volumes of pristine naval history. Beyond the famous names, thousands of pilots, bombardiers, radiomen, and turret gunners flew into anti-aircraft fire and fighter assaults to deliver their weapons on target. They flew missions in typhoons, in darkness, at extreme range, under unachievable conditions. They continued assaults against overwhelming defenses. They remained with impaired aircraft to bring injured crew members home rather than evacuating safely themselves. The Avenger provided them a fighting opportunity. Their courage accomplished the remainder.